from Patterns for Pirates, and I'm going to show you how to do the flounce on the new wrap dress. I have my dress here sewn up until that point, so I have my shoulder seams done, my side seams done, and my sleeves put in. This is a small size, it's a youth size. I have my binding piece here, and then I also have my bigger neckline flounce pieces and my smaller back ones. What I'm going to do first is sew my neckline flounce pieces together. They have a notch to align here at the side seam, so you can make sure you're putting the correct one on. So here's my longer one and my smaller one aligned at the notch, and we're going to sew down the seam. Remember, you're going to have to finish this serger tail however you like. You'll see I like to sew to the edge and flip my piece around and sew back the other way a little bit. That's how I like to finish mine off usually. We have a blog post on the Patterns for Pirates blog. If you don't know your favorite method, we have a few that you can try out and find out which one is your favorite. So here's mine. I sew to the end and then I flip it around and I sew a little bit the other way, and that's what it looks like on the outside. So I'm going to do that same thing with my mirror image pieces. Okay, now I'm going to sew these two together. At the center back. There's no notch on these pieces, but you'll just sew the short flat edge. Okay, so we have our neckline flounce all sewn up together. It's got a very sharp curve in the back and nice and twirly. Okay, you're here in my lap now, and I have my bodice facing up, my flounce facing up. I have them aligned at the center back. I'm going to come down the front of the neckline. I'm going to keep my flounce facing up. You want to make sure that your flounce isn't twisted. See, I twisted mine a little bit, so I'm going to flip that. My little one's downstairs, if you can hear him. I'm going to pin this a 1/2 inch away from the front fold, and that's so we have room for a seam allowance or a hem when we go to finish this edge. And all you're going to do is pin the rest of your flounce. When you look at your flounce for the first time, you're going to think the flounce is much longer than your neckline or your hemline, wherever you're pinning it to, but it's really not at the edges. So what I like to do is just let it fall naturally. Then I grab about halfway and connect it to the edge. And I'm just going to do that again until I feel like I can very easily ease it in. See, so after this one, you can see it really matches along the edges, even though it appears to be much longer. It's just because of that opposite curve. So I'll show you that one more time on the other side. You'll notice when I cut this out, I accidentally got some of the selvage on there, but I knew it was going to be hidden in the end, so I went ahead and left it a 1/2 inch from the edge. And then again, I like to just kind of let it lay naturally. Grab it in the middle and meet up. It's much easier for me to do it this way than trying to start at one end and going all the way to the other. When I start at one end and go all the way to the other, I always feel like I have extra flounce than dress, and when I do it this way, it always seems to work out perfectly. So now what we're going to do is we're going to add the binding. Here's my binding piece. It has a nice right and wrong side for you. I have a center notch because I always cut center notches on pieces that are on the fold. So I'm just going to line my center notch at the center back. And then I'm going to find that front neckline again. This time you're going to take your piece all the way to the edge. And pin. Your binding is going to be smaller than your neckline, so you're going to stretch it to fit. This will help keep the wrap dress snug to your body along the circular back of your neckline, and just hug towards your body along your chest to help keep that V-neck exactly where you want it. Gonna repeat on this side. Again, we're gonna go all the way down to the edge this time. The flounce is ½ inch away from the edge, but your binding goes all the way. And again, it's gonna stretch. Please excuse my husband being super silly down there with my kids. All right, and what we're gonna do is sew all the way along the front, back, and down the front again with a 1/4 inch seam allowance. Okay, I am going to take you over to my iron, and we are going to press for this next step a couple of times, so I really want to show you that. It's a really important step and you're not going to want to skip it. Okay, I'm here at my iron. I'm going to lay my bodice right sides down. Going to move my flounce towards the bodice. I'm going to press my seam allowance down towards the bodice, all along the front neckline, the back neckline, and down the other front. Pressing these next couple steps are very important. You really don't want to skip this. It will make sewing your binding much easier if you press it well, and it will give you a much more professional finish if you're sure to press. Okay, so now we're going to lay it the same way, bodice and flounce right side down. My little one's ready for a nap down there. Now what we're going to take is the edge of our binding, and we're going to fold it in 1/4 inch to 3/8 inch. And this is how wide you want your binding. If you want your binding really narrow, you can fold it all the way to 3/8, all the way to that seam line. If you want a little more wiggle room for top stitching, you can only fold it a 1/2 inch here. I usually prefer to fold mine all the way to 3/8. I like the thinner binding. It's only 1/8 inch we're talking here, so not a huge difference either way. But if you find one easier than the other, go for it. I like to fold all the way to the 3/8, all the way to that seam line, because I like the more narrow binding. We're going to go back and press this one more time. This time we're going to press the whole binding piece to the back. So I have pressed the raw edge in. Now we're going to fold the entire binding piece over. I like a teeny tiny smidge of the right side folding back or on the top, and this just keeps my binding piece from being visible on the right side. So just refolding that fold line we just pressed. It's nice and easy since we gave it a nice press. And folding everything to the back. Including a teeny tiny smidge of our front neckline. And you're going to continue this all the way down. With most fabrics, especially for this wrap dress, since we want something drapey for these flounces, I also like to pin even after a really nice press, just to make sure everything is good. When you pin, you want to make sure and not pin the flounce. We are not going to top stitch the flounce. We're going to let it be free and loose and flowy. Okay, now I'm going to go back and throw a few pins in and top stitch this. When you're pinning, you want to make sure and flip your flounce so it's not in the way. You're just going to refold at your nice pressed edges. So everything should go right back into place, and then when you pin it, I just move that flounce out of the way. And this is where we're going to be stitching. You can stitch from the underside to make sure you're catching that nice and neatly, or you can stitch from the right side to make sure it is exactly how you want it to look. Whichever way you prefer is fine. I usually stitch from the right side. But you can also stitch from the inside as well. If I'm using my cover stitch, you have to stitch from the right side. And you know what, actually I think I will show you on my machine and stitch from the inside. Usually when I'm sewing on my machine, I like to stitch from the inside. And if I'm sewing on my cover stitch, I prefer, you must stitch, got a little tail there. You must stitch from the right side, so it makes the decision easy on the cover stitch. There's only one way. Your binding is going to need to stretch to fit at this step as well. We stretched to attach it, and now we're going to have to stretch it a little bit to top stitch it as well. That's why it's important to pin. If not, you might find that you haven't stretched it evenly, and it won't look quite as nice of a finish as you want. There we go. And now I'm just going to use my zigzag stitch on my regular machine. And I'm just going to go along the edge here. It's about 3/8 inch away. If you only turned under your binding 1/4 of an inch instead of 3/8 like me, you'll have a 1/2 inch binding instead of 3/8. as I stretch my binding, I'm pulling it a little bit. I also give the exact same amount of tension on the back so that it feeds through the machine evenly. I'm not pulling it through. You still want your machine to do all of that work so your stitches are nice and even. But since I'm pulling on the front side just to pull this binding nice and even, I just put the exact same amount of pressure on the back side so that it does pull through nice and evenly. That can be a little tricky for beginners since you need to use both your hands. You want to make sure your flounce is nice and flat and your main bodice is nice and flat. The binding is barely stretched. It's about 90% of the neckline, so it is very, very small amount of stretch. A lot of knit fabrics, you'll barely feel the stretch because they are so stretchy. My binding piece is cotton spandex. My main fabric is a double brush poly. It would have worked fine for a binding as well. I just picked this one so it had a contrast for the video. It'd be nice and easy for you guys to see. Alright, so there's what it looks like on the inside, and then from the outside. And then, of course, the flounce will fall over it like that. And from the inside, again, that main piece just peeks over just a teeny tiny bit to make sure that you don't see your binding piece from the outside. And there we go. Your flounce is in, your binding is in, and now you're ready for the next couple steps.